Religion at Boston University, and this is our third panel. It's called From Script to Screen, How Content is Made and Why It Matters. And what we have on this panel are 4 people with what in the Yoruba tradition is referred to as having ashe, or the power to make things happen. These are people who have made films, who have consulted on films, made and consulted on television shows, and each of them is going to share their expertise with us. I'm going to follow on the last, on Diane from last time and not do lengthy introductions since you all have the introductions in front of you, and we'll start with Geralyn, Dreyfous, and then we'll move down the row. So thanks for being here, and look forward to this conversation. And we should have time at the end for some questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share just a little bit of a background. I work at a company called Impact Partners, and we finance social impact films. So we financed over 100 films, and our body of work really looks at sort of nonfiction narrative storytelling and tying a film with a strategy for social change or a philanthropic strategy. And as I was reflecting and speaking with Sarah about this conference and really thinking about how and when does religion show up in documentary filmmaking, I have to agree with some of Abby's comments that the documentary film world as a whole, I think, it is somewhat allergic to discussing faith or taking on issues of faith as subject matters, especially around Christianity. And it's puzzling to me because oftentimes my observation of working with social entrepreneurs and with content creators who I think of as kind of creative entrepreneurs, they usually have a very interesting story around their faith, whether they're active in it now or not, but there's usually something that was a precipitous moment that brought them to lead in the area of social entrepreneurship or in storytelling. So I was just reflecting on the body of work that we have, and we made a conscious decision as a company. We started 12 years ago to really look at stories that could help us understand, not necessarily faiths, but understand parts of the world or represent stories coming from the Muslim world, especially. We were very committed to supporting female and filmmakers and a number of Muslim filmmakers as well. And I'm going to show you some clips from 3 films. The first one I'm going to show you is called The Judge. It premiered at Toronto last year. It was on Independent Lens, and it's a story about the first female judge that adjudicates Sharia law in the Middle East, and she happens to be Palestinian. And I'll show you the trailer, and then we can talk for a minute about why we thought her story was particularly interesting to kind of explain the disconnect between what Western audiences, particularly American audiences, think of as Sharia law and what the actual practice of Sharia law is.
والله العظيم زوجي قد تركني بلا نفقة ولا منفق والله على ما أقول وكيل وشهيد. في الجيل القديم بقول لك أبصر باخذها وبيت الطاعة وبطلقها وبطلع لها شيء هذا الحكي مش سهل. شايفة؟
ما احنا العدالة ما احنا
لماذا لم تتعين المرأة في القضاء الشرعي؟ بحكم العادات والتقاليد. مين اللي وضع العادات والتقاليد؟
في مجتمعاتنا الشرقية العادات والتقاليد أصبحت أقوى من الأحكام الشرعية.
وأن أحكم بين الناس بالعدل.
It worries me to have Sharia courts. They were primarily male and they were very unjust to women.
وكانت هي جريئة. قالت لي أكثر من مرة نريد نحن كالنساء أن نتولى مناصب القضاء كالرجال.
هذا يترتب عليه مفاسد كثيرة لا تتوافق مع الأسس الشرعية.
أنا اليوم بالقرن ال21 مش ضروري أطبق إشي كان بالقرن العاشر.
المكاني محامي أبوي المحامي.
أنا ضد أن تكون قاضي يعني لحالها تحكم ببعض المواضيع.
قبل الإسلام المرأة كانت حقوقها مهضومة.
المرأة كعنصر
الرجل بيسجن بين العقل والقلب عنده، فبتكون أحكامه أكثر صواب من المرأة.
Interpretation of Islamic law is profoundly different. You can have a woman president in one country and women not allowed to drive in another.
برا اتقاتلوا، عندي لا. هي اللي متأثرة، هي اللي ما ذكرنا لها شيء الحصص، فهي اللي بتقدر ترفع الدعوة. زوجها سادي في علاقته الجنسية معها، فكيف تعطي تفاصيل هذا العنف لرجل آخر وهو القاضي؟
ما جرى مع القاضية خلود هو نتيجة لإبلاغها عن مظاهر الفساد التي كانت في القضاء الشرعي.
إذا ما حققتش العدالة لنفسي مش راح أحققها للناس.
صرت نجمي ضوت العيون نار بنور حرف النور.
We finance anywhere from 15 to 20. So we have to make choices, and a lot of times we have lots of conversations about why is this film important? Not only is this a first female judge, but it's also an opportunity for American viewers to be in Palestine, which we don't get a chance to see that country. And so it's sort of the idea of some of the stereotypes that might be confronted just by immersing yourself in the life of this woman and her family, and watching her struggle with the balancing of her family and her work and her constituents was kind of beautiful to watch. And she was completely devoted to breaking down these barriers and has been a huge champion for women's issues. So to follow her was easy to do, but it wasn't without consequences. She was fired. She wasn't allowed to. They tried to take her job away from her. She wasn't allowed to travel. It was hard to get her visas. But part of the decision making that we made in why we wanted to do it was really just this idea of representation and not hearing, from female voices, particularly in the country, I call it the country of Palestine, but some people don't. But in any case, that went into our decision making, and it was very important for Western audiences to see that Sharia law was not as strict as they thought it was. And Khalud actually came and spoke here at the Divinity School while we were making the film, and she was really great at always making points for American audiences to understand that not every Christian believes in the death penalty. She had ways for to interact with audiences so that there was a place mark or a bookmark or a place to enter into her world, which I thought was great, and that made her a great character and someone that we thought would be both very winning, very likable, very charismatic, very flawed, but also very human. So, when we get pitched films, we look at these characters that these filmmakers are following, and we ask ourselves the question, how will this person play? How will she be received? And felt like she was just such a great character that we wanted to back that film, and we're very proud of it. So I'm going to show the next film is kind of use humor as a way of understanding our differences, and it's a story about a young Indian, first generation Indian man who is turning 30 and has not been married, and his parents basically challenge him to spend 1 year with allowing them to be a screen for him for dating. And so it really, what I love about the film is this sort of, you walk into a culture that certainly I'd never spent a lot of time living in, heard about, certainly have Indian friends, but the sort of pressure or the idea of preserving culture, it was so beautiful and so emblematic of so many other cultures that have come to this country. But the humor that's used and deployed in this, I think, made it particularly fun and a great conversation maker. But it was also a great exercise in people really looking at the whole institution of marriage and was it working, and who's to say which one is better or worse, where you choose your partner for love or your family helps you choose that partner, and where do those traditions come from, and how do they assimilate over time or change over time. So I just want to share this one because I think it's particularly fresh and funny.
How do we want to do this?
Just start at the beginning of the story.
Right. The story starts 2 years ago in LA. I had just broken up with Audrey, and I was miserable. We'd been together for 2 years, and I had never told Mom and Dad about her. In fact, they were freaking out because, you know, here I was, almost 30, never married, which in our culture is like...
Code red.
Code red.
We are having a great time with the family. Next time, we are going to come with the grandchildren.
Here's the thing. In Mom and Dad's eyes, I had no idea how to get a girlfriend. I don't know how they fell in love, but Mom and Dad are the happiest couple I've ever seen.
The way you guys married, would that work for me as well?
Yeah.
Not even a doubt. There's a matchmaking. This girl is good with that boy, but that boy is good with this girl. So all the girls and all the boys get married.
Dad sent me 20 pictures and resumes of matrimonial candidates, which is totally normal, right?
How are we going to set it up? It's not going to happen automatically.
I don't want you guys jumping and getting all these other people involved.
Looks good, so I'm going to forward this to Ravi, okay?
Within weeks, my biodata was in the hands of uncles, aunts, family, friends, and complete strangers.
Hey, I'm Ravi. Hey, I'm Ravi.
Hey, I'm Ravi. Oh, wait, we already met.
This is exhausting, isn't it?
I see progress.
No messages.
Pretty impressive.
You're just having a date, I'm just filming.
That's just weird.
I love that I get to watch this.
Put that camera down right now.
I'm getting in the practice of, like, pursuing women.
Are you good at this? Well, you're Indian. You're not going to be good.
My sister has 3 grandkids and we are happy family.
Whenever kids doesn't even care to get married.
What would be the downside of me marrying a white girl?
No, how can we start it? What's all that right?
Everybody needs that love, the kind that you find and you can't get enough. Wanna keep that buzz, cause it is what it is, but it isn't what it was.
Be shy. Talk to her, man. Take a little interest. Don't just look at her and say, oh, I don't like her. When you talk to her, she may not know why you are talking to her.
We'll support you, baby.
This is the most unnecessary pep speech I've ever gotten in my life.
I love this picture. This is the closest an Indian picture ever gets to kissing.
This should be considered obscene by some people.
We ended up funding that film because we had funded a film, which I'm going to show you a trailer of now. Geeta Patel's first film was done with a woman named Sanan Khashoggi, and the two of them were roommates, and they both were first generation. One was first generation Pakistani, one was first generation Indian. Their parents both came from Kashmir, but from different sides of the equation, and they didn't even know what the conflict was. In fact, they had lived together for 2 years, and they had never discussed whether they were Hindu or Muslim. And so they decided to go on this journey back to where their parents were from to understand their roots, but also to try to understand the ethnic conflict in Kashmir. So we'll show that, and I think I'm...
Do you think that there's something that we could know that might help us?
You should not trust anyone. Most of them are double-speak. Why? Because that's their survival tactics. Yes, be cool, be diplomatic. Don't be a typical American.
Meanwhile, world leaders are pressuring both India and Pakistan to prevent the conflict over Kashmir from turning into a devastating nuclear exchange.
How are you?
That's great.
I'm Sinan.
Sinan.
And this
And Gita
is on the other side.
Gita on the other side.
Assalamu alaikum.
It's a mess in Kashmir right now.
We came here to figure out what exactly is going on.
I've seen people talking and losing their lives.
Why will anybody tell you the truth? A stranger coming from outside, why will they tell you the truth? Let's go.
You will not take the photograph of this camp, otherwise I'll bloody throw it out, okay? Under the barrel of the gun, you're asking people to say, do you want to live with India or Pakistan? What do you expect? This is an Indian gun here.
Just don't keep it you. They can shoot you from there. There are people who have vested interest to turn it into a religious struggle. It's not about Hindus and Muslims. It's nothing like that.
क्यों निकले आप वहाँ से?
मुसलमान वहाँ पर है। मुसलमान भी बहुत मर गए। Whatever your perceptions will be, it should be the closest to the truth of Kashmir. That there is this one perception, there is this one perception.
It's all over now.
इसे बेटर है मरना।
We're not going to change. That's the bottom line.
We have suffered in every way we can, but still we carry on. We don't know how long we have to live. So let's celebrate each and every day. Let's enjoy.
So I'll just end by saying at the time that we financed that film, we had, the United States was in an occupied situation in Iraq, and we were kind of asking ourselves questions like, how can arguably three of the strongest or most vibrant or vital democracies also have occupation and curfews and divides like we had in the situation in Kashmir with Israel and Palestine, and then ourselves. So we then set out to work with filmmakers that were exploring those questions, and that was one of the films that we funded as a way to kind of have, again, the trope, if you will, would be these are two American first-generation friends that we're going to learn about their past, and so we're often looking at sort of what's the right vehicle for a story, not necessarily to teach us about religion, but to explain to us or to help us actually experience what life on the ground may be in places that we read about. And those are just 3 examples, and I think I'm out of time, but I'm available for questions. Thanks.
Steve made just one error when he spoke. I am not someone important involved in the
the industry. I'm a simple academic. This is how we make our living here. It's the last book. So I want to thank Diane Moore for inviting me here. And when she was speaking yesterday about the sort of three sort of problematic things, a single story, made me think of the blessed John Berger, who we lost a year or so, 2 years now, in January. Never again, John wrote, will a single story be told as if it were the only one. I think that, and I always try to remember that line of the multiplicity of these stories. Thanks to Sarah and Laura for their arrangements. Thanks to all of you for being here. My master was the blessed Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who for some 20 years directed the Center for the Study of World Religions here at Harvard. So it's a delight to be back in the master's house. I was actually talking with Dean Hempton yesterday, and thank you again for your hospitality in hosting us here, about Wilfred. And people don't remember him, unfortunately, that in 1940, he was in Toronto. In 1940, there were about 5,000 Muslims in Canada. He wanted to study Islam. So he went to the country with the most Muslims, which in 1940 was India, before partition. He and Muriel lived there from 40 to 46, left in 47, came back in 48, and saw the remnants of the violence, the horrific violence. At least 500,000 people in that area in the Punjab, who'd killed each other, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims. And for him, that was I think the driving force for what he did. How do we understand ourselves? How do we work in this world? We can't be objective scholars in the white lab coat saying, what a curious phenomenon. These people seem to have butchered themselves. Let us investigate. That's immoral. So we have to be engaged. And so I come from that tradition of very, very serious. And there wasn't a more serious scholar than Wilfred, but being engaged and to be serious are not incompatible there. I want to talk a little bit here about some of my own experiences as a Muslim who's a scholar of Islam. Born in Pakistan, came to Toronto in 1970 when there were less than 35,000 Muslims in Canada. Now there's over 1 million with the National Household Census. While the population has grown, we're not there on television, as a number of folks have talked about. So this was the one East Indian, as we South Asians were known in the 70s, could relate to, was Haji. Wasn't quite sure how a child had gone on the pilgrimage and earned the title of Haji. And then later they changed it to Haji Singh, which is sort of this interesting, I'm not sure how a Sikh person is able to make the Hajj, but what do you do? Max Klinger, Jamie Farr on MASH, Arab character, but like Tony Shalhoub, unusual sort of Arab character. You can see the tagline, the real OCD. He's got obsessive compulsive disorder. And most of the Arabs, of course, on television then were Christian, not Muslims, reflecting the reality of American life, that half the Arabs in America are Arab Christians, not Arab Muslims. As a kid, I stayed up watching Roots and was delighted to see that Kunta Kinte, played by LeVar Burton, was a Muslim. I had no idea about the transatlantic slave trade and the Muslims involved in that. I knew about African American athletes, and these were my heroes. And I don't see Ron here. Oh, sorry. I was going to talk about you if you weren't here, but no, exactly. So no disrespect to Serena. I worship at the altar of Roger Federer, and I will say that Serena is the greatest tennis player of all time. I do not think you can call yourself the greatest athlete of all time when you were separated from your opponent by a net. My boy, Muhammad Ali, is the greatest athlete of all time. We can talk about that later. What's that? Hussain, yeah, running away running is a skill. Exactly. We'll get into this later on. But Ali, was quite simply the greatest athlete. Let me say that again: the greatest athlete I've ever seen. And I've seen some athletes, Ali, and the combination, the speed, the power, the ability. I can tell stories there. And then Lou Alcindor, as he is here, then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So folks would come in Ali's case, you can see, we chose that picture, the fruit of Islam, coming in through the Nation of Islam, Kareem coming in straight through Sunni Islam. And then there were some surprising things. So one of my favorite comedies, WKRP in Cincinnati, Tim Reed played Venus Flytrap, and in the final season, Venus is about to get arrested or something, and when the detective asks, he's praying in the elevator, and the detective asks him if he's a Muslim. Really interesting kind of thing, the construction of black with Muslim, which is not unsurprising given that at least a quarter, depending on who you ask, it's between a quarter and 40% of American Muslims are African Americans. So there's history here. When I ask my students to name a Muslim on television, they're stumped. Someone comes up with Apu from The Simpsons, and someone, of course, very quickly says, no, Apu's not Muslim, he's Hindu. The real Simpsons fans know Bashir bin Laden from the My Pods and Broomsticks episode. So you do have like a Muslim character on The Simpsons. Dave Chappelle. For 3 years, the Chappelle Show, just incandescent, transcendental. Chappelle's Muslim, and yet none of the characters on the show were Muslim. Who are the ones that you know? Well, Syed Jarrah on Lost. Eamon Walker. Imam Karim Saeed on Oz. This is interesting, I was talking about this at lunch. This is the first regular Muslim character on American television. It's the Karim Saeed character. Tom Fontana had no desire to create the first regular Muslim character on American television. Tom Fontana, for those who know, did cop shows, Homicide. That cop shows end when the bad guy goes to prison. He wanted to take it to the next step. What happens in prison? That was Oz. If you remember before The Sopranos, Oz, I think, was actually HBO's first drama series that they did. And if you're doing the archaeology of prisons, you have to talk about the gangs in prisons, including black Muslims. And so you had this. So really interesting kinds of ways where, in a roundabout way, Tom Fontana creates this really, really interesting character. Contrasted with my world that I grew up in, pro wrestling. I grew up working class poor. This is our opera, our theater, our stage where good and evil, is fought, literally, But you look at the Muslims, the Iron Sheik, Muhammad Hussain, Abdullah the Butcher, the other Sheik, just these villainous heel sorts of characters, not reflective of the reality of American Muslim life, where American Muslims are by and large wealthy, educated, doctors, lawyers. I mean, I'm disappointed in my family because I'm not a real doctor. I tell my mother that. I do have a doctorate. No, you're not a real doctor. The kind that helps people. And then, without getting too much into politics, you look at this statement, then candidate, Trump. Islam hates us. Now, I'm not sure how religion hates people, but put that aside. I was actually with Diane in DC on January the 27th, the day of the travel ban. And coming back, it was delightful to see the protests, especially, and I was talking to Sarah about this, the protests coming from the Jewish community, who know more than anyone where this road of intolerance and oppression leads. And seeing, Jews standing up for Muslims as Muslims. Really powerful. So in a funny way, I think one of the unintended consequences of the Trump era, I've lived in Los Angeles for 21 years now, and I've done Muslim-Jewish work for 21 years. I've never seen the communities more together than in the last year and a half or so. I was going to talk a little bit about some of these things. This was already raised. I think, Lorraine, you actually had this tagline here, the friends, neighbors, husbands, terrorists, sleeper cell that Showtime did about American Islam. Sort of interesting. Michael Ealy plays like the Muslim hero here with Oded Fehr, and it's always great when the Israeli plays the Arab who's the bad guy in the film. Just levels of complexity there. And this is shot at Sinai Temple, in Los Angeles. Some of you remember this show, which unfortunately just ran for one season, Aliens in America. Really lovely show about this high school family that was going to adopt what they thought was like a Norwegian. There's some things there with Mr. Trump. Anyway, a Norwegian exchange student, but they end up getting, Raju Musharraf from Pakistan, who wears a shalwar kameez and talks with an accent. And it's about negotiating high school and fitting in, and what better metaphor for religion than, in a funny way, sort of high school, sort of finding your niche. The comedies work in really interesting ways. Community. If you remember Community, 5 seasons on NBC, 6th season on Yahoo, and the movie rumored to be in the work, set in a community college. And Danny Pudi plays Abed Nadir, who's a Muslim. He's got an Indian father and a Polish mother, who's a nod to Danny, who actually does have a Indian father and a Polish mother. In this episode, his cousin Abra, who's in full burqa, comes to visit. And I love this show, mostly because Iqbal Thiba plays plays Abed's father, and his name in the show is Gobi, which is cauliflower for those that know Urdu. And it's one of those sort of subversive kinds of plays. That's not a guy's name, that's the name of a dish, you know, but you use that. And he's supposed to be Palestinian, but of course Iqbal Thiba is Pakistani. And so I don't know if it's like Palestinian and Pakistan come into like Pakistan as some sort of, you know, thing in the American psyche there. But lovely, lovely show that deals, I think there's literally like 3 episodes that deal with Abed's Muslims. So that's the way to deal with the work. Little Mosque on the Prairie, we talked about this Canadian television show that Zarka Nawaz did in 2007. Ran for 6 seasons. Lovely, lovely show that talks about the complex realities of Muslim life. And it's much about big town, small town. Zarka grew up in Toronto, moved with her family to the prairies. And it's as much as being a fish out of water, going from the big city to the small town. But really lovely. I want to just conclude by talking a little bit about my own involvement in some of this kind of work. It's something I never thought I would do, you know, as a scholar of Islam. And in 2007, I got a call from Nancy Miller's office, who's the showrunner for this show. I don't remember if people saw this on TNT, Saving Grace, extraordinary Holly Hunter's Grace Hanadarko, you know, who's a police detective in Oklahoma City, whose family's killed in the Murrah family, the Murrah Federal Building bombing in 1995, which was initially thought to have been committed by Muslims, and of course it was white supremacists, you know, who did this. You know, lovely show, and in the show. Bokeem Woodbine, another transcendental actor, plays this Muslim inmate, Leon Cooley, who converts to Islam in prison, and able to help the writers write some really interesting kinds of things about that conversion, including a scene where Leon Rippey plays this angel, Earl, who's like the last chance angel for both the Holly Hunter character and the Bokeem Woodbine character. And Leon's afraid that when he converts to Islam, he'll lose the angel because, of course, he's a Christian angel. And it's a lovely scene where he converts, makes the Shahada, and there's Earl standing behind him saying, Assalamu alaikum. You know, that angels are angels. There's not Muslim angels. It's not like a Christian God or a Muslim God. There's God. It's not like there's Muslim angels, Christian angels. There's angels here. Most recently, I've worked since 2015 on Story of God with Morgan Freeman, and we did this in DC. Beside Mr. Freeman is Muhammad Zakaria, the most important American Muslim calligrapher. Phenomenal, phenomenal talent. And I just want to show a little clip of that show. So I've been a consultant on the show, and as someone who's been told very often that I have a great face for radio, I was actually very pleasantly surprised when they said, well, do you want to be on the show? And I'm like, okay. So this is more for street cred than anything else here. Sorry, so I'll end with this.
I've always had a thirst for knowledge. Still read everything I can get my hands on. This instinct to learn about our world and try to understand it is universal. Civilization itself is based on our drive for knowledge. But does that knowledge bring us closer to the truth of God? The answer to that may depend on whether you believe the words we write come from our minds or from God.
All of the world's major religions have a sacred text. The Sikhs have a book called the Guru Granth Sahib. The Jewish faith has the Torah. Both offer divine wisdom to their followers. I'm at the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. to see how the words of the Quran are more than holy wisdom for the Muslim faithful. They are proof of God. Dr. Amir Hussain is a scholar of the Islamic tradition.
It's like hearing Morgan say that. It's just...
How are you? I'm very well indeed. Nice to see you. Now, up there, yes. What are we looking at?
What you see are verses from Quran. So right here up in the light, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, literally in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate.
Ar-Rahman, the merciful, ar-Rahim, the compassionate.
So those are two of the names of God.
So then calligraphy has a special place in me.
Absolutely. To make beauty out of those letters, out of those words, is really important, for instance. You know, through the words that God speaks. For Christians, God's word is the Bible, and God's word really is Jesus. You know, God come to earth in flesh. For Muslims, the Quran is God come to earth in book. So the very words of the Quran are the words of God.
Proof of God is the Quran.
Is the Quran. You know, if you ask
the fact that it exists.
Absolutely, that it exists, that God reveals God's self to human beings in these words. And in these words in Arabic. 80% of Muslims don't use Arabic as their day-to-day language, but the words of the Quran are always in Arabic.
So it's been a delight to work on that show with Mr. Freeman. The third season this fall, they haven't given us air dates yet, but look for it on National Geographic. And you know, during the Q&A, we can talk about this. And really the last year, you know, when you think of Mahershala Ali winning Best Supporting Actor for Moonlight, when you think about Hassan Minhaj with Homecoming King, when you think about Aziz Ansari and the kinds of stuff that he's done in Master of None. So really interesting connections with the other folks here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for hanging in this afternoon. So I'm the head of programming for a company called Transform Films, and we make documentaries, long and short form documentaries, that deal with issues in our society that are important to all of us. You know, we've tackled issues like mass incarceration, gender violence, gun violence, racial inequality, economic inequality. The list goes on. There are too many issues that we all have to deal with. But the way that we do it is really in great storytelling that lifts up characters, and so that their voices create empathy with the audience, and it's in creating that connection that we can lead to change, I think. I think what makes us unique in the world of documentary, and it's a blessing and a curse, is our parent company is a multi-faith nonprofit organization, and that leads to some challenges for us. But what Odyssey Impact does, which is our parent company, we do impact outreach using those films for direct engagement with the films, so that we can talk to people of faith, people who come from secular organizations, sort of bringing people together around films to, you know, sort of really encourage the dialogue that, you know, Diane mentioned this morning that, you know, she quoted Abby last night, the question mark versus the exclamation point. Well, we're all about the question mark and creating that dialogue and that space for people to really engage with these issues. So in Transform Films, we create these films that very often, mostly, are not films about religion, right? But they're about themes that are important to people of faith. So I want to show you a clip, and then I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've found operating in the independent film space. And again, Abby alluded to it. You know, Geralyn alluded to it, that when you're coming from a faith space, there are some challenges that you have to deal with. So the clip I'm going to show you is from a film that is going to premiere on Netflix next week, September 28th. sister calendars. It's called Lessons from a School Shooting, Notes from Dunblane. Geralyn is one of the executive producers on it, and the Harvard Divinity School is one of the kind supporters of the film as well. It grew out of a feature film that we did several years back, right after the school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown. The filmmaker, Kim Snyder, really embedded herself in that community. And there were many stories. Our initial entree into the community was through the faith groups in town. And Kim really sort of took that access and built it over time, and built trust in an amazing way that led to the feature film Newtown, which some of you may have heard of, an extraordinary Peabody winning documentary that aired on Independent Lens last year. Well, this is film, a 20-minute film that was shot during that same year. This story didn't make it into that film, but it's a really important story that looks at what trauma looks like and how people process trauma. In this case, it's the trauma that the first responders, and specifically the clergy as first responders, have to deal with. So let's see, let me get out of here. So this is just a short clip. Have a look. The film deals with a lot of issues between two communities across space and time that have dealt with a very similar issue. So you have Newtown, which is very freshly dealing with a school shooting, and you have a community in Dunblane, Scotland, that dealt with a similar shooting about 20 years ago. And some of the parallels, what was the same, what was different, but what was really unique is the relationship between these two men who...
This is from a parish that they had a Christmas tree, and these are the ornaments from the tree with a prayer that each of the families wrote and put on the tree. This hurt is so real, just unimaginable. Something like this could happen here. How do you live with that? I don't think, people know how hard this is. I really don't. I don't know if that's really if it's had the impact, just to see so many people just so affected.
Dear Father, my name is Monsignor Basil O'Sullivan, an Irish priest living in Dunblane, Scotland, where we had a similar tragedy to yours some 16 years ago. 16 very young children were murdered at school, together with their teacher, and some 12 other children were wounded. Your tragedy brought a lot of memories back to us here in Dunblane. Our town remained depressed for at least a year before things began to get back to something like normal. Sadly, even today, we get unhappy repercussions of the event. I buried that little boy, John Petrie, and I buried that's Joe and Sam Hamler's child. 5 years, a very short span. It took the best part of a week to get through all the films. I like to inform you that in this Church of the Holy Family there were prayers and tears for you all at Mass this Sunday morning.
Dear Monsignor O'Sullivan, thank you so much for your emails of support, prayers, and encouragement. It's been overwhelming in so many ways. The town is very different and very somber, so I'm not quite sure when and if we will all bounce back. God bless, and a special thanks to you, Monsignor Bob Weiss. We had 8 funerals in this church, plus many of their wakes were held here as well. So You know, we wore white vestments, we wore purple vestments, we wore pink vestments, you know, we wore bows, we wore whatever it took to let that funeral belong to that child and that family. These are not anonymous people. They're very much a part of this community, and the trust that they were willing to place in me as their pastor to, you know, for the honor. To bury their child, you know. It's an honor.
My dear Monsignor Bob, many thanks for taking the trouble to answer my email. I realize how tired you can become, if nothing else, from publicity. I am attaching my account of the events in Dunblane. We in Dunblane refer to it as the school incident. No doubt you will find much of the account in accord with your own experience.
So I think that one of the things that strikes me in terms of the conversation here about that film and that clip and religious literacy is that it's a story that those of us who are not clergy don't know, don't see, don't realize the things, the way that these events sort of weigh on faith leaders and how they have to process that or don't process that. I mean, I think it's a real problem, and we've actually been talking to a number of people in the field who are really welcoming this kind of dialogue. I just wanted to talk very, very briefly, just give you a quick rundown of how we got to where we are and what we do, because I think it's important to this discussion. A number of years ago, the first film that we did was a film called Serving Life, which appeared on the OWN network. And it was actually the first film in their, when the network first launched, the OWN Documentary Club. And it was a feature film about a prisoner-run hospice program at the Louisiana State Prison. It's an excellent film, and I would highly recommend anyone see it. What was wonderful for us is that OWN commissioned that film, and so they paid for it, which is great, but they own it, so we can't do anything with it in our Odyssey mission work, right? So our mission as Odyssey Impact, as our nonprofit, is to use media essentially to bring together faith and secular people to create a more just, compassionate world. And we got enormous responses from, or inquiries from, prisons, from hospices, from hospitals, from academic spaces asking us if they could show that film and use that film, and we couldn't do anything with it. So we decided that we needed to make a change into independent documentaries, and actually Newtown was our first foray into that. But what we found, and again I'll echo what Abby said, is that the independent film community was very suspicious of a faith-based organization. And so we had a number, and to Kim Snyder's credit, she was completely open-minded when we talked to her about working on Newtown. But we found that we had to change the way that we did business, and that's really how we set up Transform Films to operate independently of what we do in our mission work that comes out of Odyssey Impact. So the films that we do in Transform Films, we work with independent filmmakers. We produce some, we co-produce some, people bring projects to us. We work in many different ways. But those films don't have a faith-based mission behind them. They really are lifting up stories that illuminate the social issues that we deal with. And then they feed into Odyssey Impact, which is where, and my colleague Melissa Potter is here, and she heads up that initiative. But that's really where we're able to do direct engagement with people around these films and dig deeper into some of those issues and move people to action, right? We want to change people's awareness, attitude, and action at Odyssey Impact. So that's who we are, and thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to
answer any questions you have later.
So I'm going to change what I was going to talk about a little bit, put in some other things based on so many things that I've heard here. Abby's opening presentation was terrific, and one thing I was struck by was that she talked about her own background in relationship to faith. I'm one of those people who has virtually none. I'm Jewish by culture. My mother was religious, my father was not. At 13, I refused to be bar mitzvahed because I'd never gone to Hebrew school, and they offered me a deal. They said, we'll give you the short 6-week course and you can have it. And I was appalled at the corruption of the system. I mean, I was just like, what is this? And even as a young child, I don't think I had much of a relationship to faith. And so maybe because I never walked away from it, when we became documentary filmmakers, after we made our first film about a Jewish home for the aged, Home for Life, our next set of films were all funded by a progressive Catholic adult education. A couple of nice Jewish boys, we had no problem with it. We were like thrilled, and we had a great time convincing them that whatever we wanted to do really fit with their mission. We were greatly influenced by Chronicle of a Summer by Jean Rouch, this very seminal documentary. We were like, okay, inquiring nuns. 2 nuns go around Chicago asking people if they're happy. That's what we had seen in that film. So I want to show you a couple of clips, and I know I'm going to need help with this, from one of those early films, which it's 1967, and they're, the 2 clips are, and what was happening was, this is the northwest side of Chicago. These are the children of firemen and policemen, a very conservative Catholic parish. And these are high school students who are dealing with the contradiction of what they're learning in the church. What they're being taught is the value of their religion, the values of their religion, and what they're encountering in their world in terms of the coming Vietnam War, in terms of race relationships of Chicago. And they have this club they call Thumbs Down, and they put on youth mass. So first you're going to see them planning this mass, and then the next scene is a little bit later in the film when they're pitching it to the young priest who's going to conduct the mass.
There's a lot of it.
Who's going to give the homily?
I don't know.
It looks like the guy in the green shirt that's sitting next to you there.
I think Tom O'Brien will do it. I don't know.
I'm not sure either.
We can decide that later. But anyway, and then after the sermon is over, if enough people are, enough people we hope will be upset by it, I don't know exactly how this will work, but someone else can get up there, whether it be Father Del Rey or somebody else in the group, and ask the people exactly what they think, what they're feeling right now. Ask them to look into themselves, and if they feel hatred for the person that just had spoken, then they shouldn't really be sitting in that church at all, because that's not what Christianity is all about. They might disagree with the person, but they cannot hate the person for what he said.
It's sort of like...
Go ahead.
It's sort of like dramatic technique rather than just talking at people and preaching. It's a technique of actually getting them emotionally involved against you, and then pointing out calmly or whatever you want that this particular reaction they had isn't Christian or something like that. Maybe I can explain it better for Tom. These people that are sitting in the mass, in the audience, have a reaction of hate towards this person that's giving the homily. And they're doing exactly the same thing that the Jews did to Christ, or the crucifixion of Christ. They hated Christ because he presented an ideal that they didn't like, and they crucified him. And this is what we want to show. We don't want to embarrass people.
Okay, and then the next scene is a few days later. There's been a terrific call between the young girl and Jack and the priest on the phone, where they're kind of pitching him this idea, and they're you see them on camera trying to tell each other what to say. It's just the sexual politics are very funny, and now they've come to pitch it.
Itself, you want to present a position of not of in any way attacking the war. No, of love. Maybe stressing the concept of the Christian view of non-violence to an extent, and the idea of peace and love, right? I mean, as long as but if it's in any way so directed that everyone just senses, the weight of this is anti-war propaganda. If this is what it is, then I think that you're being dishonest with the people. Just as much you're condemning everyone else for being dishonest maybe at times.
We're not so much talking about anti-war, we're talking about O'Brien being Christ. He states what he believes, and if these people want to crucify him for it, then what in the hell are they doing at Mass? You see what I mean?
You want to make Tom O'Brien Christ? Is this what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
No, the thing that's going to hit him is here's this perfect middle class, real honey up there with his tie and suit and nice combed hair and clean shaved, and he's going to say, but I believe in war.
See, it's a new concept. It's like Christ. He was very accepted.
They know
Christ was, he was just like everyone else.
in the background. That's why.
I'm not going to. I'll sit in the last row. No.
So right from the beginning, I think we are some of those social justice left-wing filmmakers who had no fear of the question of faith and religion. And our interest, these films, what I just showed you, the clips, we were verite films. So we went into people's lives, we followed what happened. We may have started with some research and our preconceived notions, but we were very committed to really following the story. And religion and faith is a part of people's lives. It's in virtually all of our movies in one way or another. And one of the things that I'm sort of picking up when we talk about images of other kinds of people, what several of you have been speaking about, how do you talk to people? How do you make people understand each other? And we talked earlier, someone talked about Fox News and the news. We live in our silos. And for me, I've always been passionate about in terms of documentary is that I think it's a critical part of a democracy. That what documentary can do is move people's emotions. And I want to read something, just brief. This is kind of the quote that got Cartemquin going. And I was a student at the University of Chicago, and I was reading in philosophy, and this is a quote from the American philosopher John Dewey. And he says, where did it go here? Artists have always been the real purveyors of the news, for it is not the outward happening in itself which is new, but the kindling of it by emotion, perception, and appreciation. So that's what documentary is, and that's why it can change people. I was going to show a couple of other clips, which it turns out are on a different DVD from the one that I brought here. It's back in the hotel room. But I'm going to briefly describe them to you because they both elicit emotion very quickly. One is 90 seconds. It's from a series that we did in 2000 called The New Americans. And it was about immigrants coming to America at that time. It was after Hoop Dreams. We had a bit of a chit that we could cash in. And we said, immigration is going to be an issue. We need to be there. And so we followed families. We spent a lot of time with them in their home countries before they ever got to America, so you could understand what they left behind. And this 90-second scene, and sometimes you work, and I'm sorry I didn't bring them because we always kind of, what can I show at a thing like this? What will be short enough? This sums up our 7-hour series. It's a young boy in rural Mexico saying goodbye. He's 6 or 7 years old. I think he's in the 2nd grade. And finally, the family is going to immigrate to the US. The father's been working on this for years. And he's saying goodbye to his school, which has no windows and a dirt floor. And it's a good school, and it's a great teacher, and it moves your heart. It's a really powerful visual scene. It's emotional. she's crying, and you understand he's leaving something incredibly valuable to him behind in that school and with that teacher. And I had a wonderful, fortunate moment, which is he walks out against the door, it's kind of blown out by the light, and his little kid is going like this. The other scene is from the Palestinian story. And the Palestinian woman, her dream is to come to America. She's finally in America. She's engaged to a Palestinian-American guy. And for reasons I'll never understand, he's decided to teach her to drive at night. And so they're in the car, and the camera's not in the back seat. Your camera's looking at them. You can see their faces. And he's, stop, stop, stop. And she like jams on the brakes. And this happens in English and Arabic. They switch back and forth. She's like, why are you yelling at me? There's nobody there. Why are you yelling at me? He says, I know, but a kid could run out and you have to be able to stop quickly. And she says to him, why don't you run out and see if I can stop? And it's 30 seconds. And that's the other piece of what we look for. And it always, I love it because it's always, when you see it on the screen, it takes a moment to land, and it's a gender laugh. The women always laugh first. I want to show another clip because we do think strategically about, and Abigail also, she talked about this. She did a film about a minister. We came across a story. We had been, okay, well, I'm going to show this one last clip. Very quickly, we came across this is going to be at the death house door clip. We came across a story about a death house minister in Texas who had presided over 99 executions. And it resonates with your story about trauma. What did this guy do after every execution? He came back and he recorded an audio tape about how he felt because he had no one to talk to about the trauma that he had been through. Very conservative guy. He looks conservative. He's a Republican. You can smell it all over him. And so this, I'll show the clip.
Even to this day, I don't understand how I got where I am. From 1982 until 1995, I was ministered to 95 inmates who were put to death by lethal injection. I never intended to do 95. In fact, I didn't intend to do one, but it happened. After each execution, I made a tape on everybody that I walked with to the death chamber. I knew that I had to talk to somebody. And the only thing in my house at that time was a tape recorder. Some of these are well-known people, some of them are unknown, and then there are others I know were not guilty of the crime for which they were put to death. On that one, everything went against what I felt.
So that was very much the similar kind of strategy. When we stumbled on this story, we were approached by the Tribune, which had two reporters who were reporting on actually the case that he's talking about of the innocent guy who was put to death. And when they told us about the minister and the tapes, we were like, okay, I think there's a movie there. And if I haven't, do I have another 30 seconds or am I done? I got it, 30 seconds. I just want to tell you one other quick story, because this question came up too, which is what do we leave out? And as filmmakers, we do at times leave things out. There was a moment in Hoop Dreams, I was going to show a clip from Hoop Dreams, but I don't have the time, but it's a church scene. But there's a moment in Hoop Dreams where one of the boys is being prepared for the SAT exams, and the teacher who's been helping him, she's been very dedicated, says, just guess. It's a multiple choice test. Even a monkey would get some of these right. Well, this is African-American family. This was going to have a big African-American audience. That's very charged language. She didn't know what she had said. She didn't know what she meant. And in that case, we took it out. So we made a decision that this, you know, in another situation, you would leave it in because it would be an example of a kind of racism. The church scene that I was going to show, and this is maybe more controversial, we show it in a very positive light. The man is off drugs now. He's come back to the family, Arthur's father, and it's a very emotional church scene. Arthur walks out. He's still mad at his father. But what we don't put in is that this is a very patriarchal church. This is a church which is basically telling women to do what their husband says. And we struggled with that because we knew that was the case. On the other hand, we didn't have a character who brought it into our story. And so it was left out. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those presentations. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So, and we have mics again. So just raise your hand and we'll come find you. And I have a question while we wait. We heard from Roan earlier on about the documentary as sort of the place to tell the truth in complexity, and three of you are involved in documentary films. I suppose the Morgan Freeman series is a kind of documentary. What do you think about that? Do you want to pat your own backs for having chosen the right genre, or is it just the case that every genre from the epic poem to the haiku is a way to tell a story, and you just tell the story the best you can in whatever genre you're using? What do you all think?
I would say the latter, that we, you know, that's a false question. You know, Werner Herzog loves to create that argument with documentary. You guys claim that you're telling the truth, and you know, we never claim that. It's all about how you tell the story. It's all about the art of how it's made. And I see a feature sometimes and I'm like, that's true. And it's this, you know, there's no magic to documentaries. What is the magic of documentaries, if you do it right, is that you have to go into another culture. And the question mark for me always is, where am I and what's happening?
Nice.
No, and just obviously agreeing with Gordon that I'm thinking now of Edward Said's Joseph Conrad and the fiction of autobiography. That, you know, autobiography by definition is fiction, you know, and how do you come up with these things? And you get, you know, in the days when fake news used to mean Jon Stewart on The Daily Show and not, you know, the real news, but Stewart would often talk about the fact that the fake news was kind of on par with the real news. And now again, part of that was you have half an hour to do this kind of thing. It's not a 24-hour news cycle. You have really good writers, you know, come up with material there, but often there's more truth in fiction than anything else.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think that we're storytellers, and finding the best way to tell the story, whatever the medium is what we do.
Great. Okay, question out here. Yeah.
Thank you. My question actually builds on this because I'm recognizing, of course, that documentary is perhaps the most hospitable medium for advancing complex understandings of religion and other issues. But who watches documentaries? I'm just really struck by that. I mean, like, my kids don't watch documentaries, so it just seems like the elephant in the room is much bigger mainstream media. And I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Well, the audience for documentaries has grown exponentially over the last 10 years. When I first got into this business, there were 4 news channels: PBS, NBC, CBS, ABC, and there was a real bias against funding documentaries in the philanthropic world because they felt like you had public television. What more did you need? But really, with the advent of technology, you can find audiences for all sorts of content, good and bad. And it's incumbent upon the filmmaker and the content creators to find their audiences if they're going to be commercially viable. And we're seeing all sorts of success using social media platforms, doing grassroots screenings, using, they have a new word, eventize, where you can release a film in many theaters at the same time and have a conversation. So there's all sorts of new ways to engage audiences. And I think, part of the power of making documentary films is to know who your audience is. You're not making you're not making a film for everybody. But you should have a plan for how you want the film to go out in the world and where you want it to live. And that also is your job as a content creator. So there's a lot of strategy involved in how to make the content that you create actually have purpose and sing and have impact. And we can talk a lot about that, but it's very true that we're not making content for a lot of different demographics. And it's also very true that with trailers and with conversations and with media coverage about a story, like I'll use the example of The Hunting Ground. We made a film about rape on college campuses. It was basically shelved by CNN. They showed it once at 10 o'clock at night on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. So it was really never broadcast, right? But we had grassroots screenings of that film on every single college campus in America. And we also made a song with Lady Gaga that never was on the radio because it was about rape. But we released it, and over 120 million people. She was up for a Grammy, and she was up for an Academy Award for a song that was never on the radio. So you have to really know how you use your content when you make it, is my answer to that.
I would add that I completely agree with what Geralyn said. I mean, there are lots of different ways now that there are many more opportunities and sort of that strategic thinking behind it. I also think that there are many more formats now that documentarians are working on, and some of those have greater accessibility to different audiences. So it's sort of tailoring your content to who you want to see it as well. So I think we're at a sort of a very rich moment right now for the distribution of documentaries.
Yeah, we've done short things on Facebook and platforms like that.
This question is for Dr. Hussain. I saw a photo of Muhammad Ali that you had up there when he was part of the Nation of Islam. Later on, he embraced Sunni Islam. What is the difference between Nation of Islam and mainstream Islam?
Thanks, that's a great question. So in a nutshell, when Elijah Muhammad, who's really the key figure behind the Nation of Islam, dies in '76, his son, Warithdin Muhammad, sort of brings the Nation of Islam into Sunni orthodoxy. So when you're looking at the Nation of Islam, and now the rhetoric of the nation is that it always was this case, that if W.D. Farr and Elijah Muhammad were preaching if they were saying in 1934 what they would have said in 1976, no one would listen to them. And so it started off as being very different, that you didn't, the ministers were called ministers, not imams, you worshipped at temples, you didn't read the Quran. It was more like a Sunday afternoon church service than it was a Muslim service. And then it was under really Warithdin Muhammad that the nation sort of comes into Sunni orthodoxy and starts doing the kinds of practices, to the point that Louis Farrakhan says, wait a minute, you're actually not following the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. And he sort of restarts the nation on the principles of Elijah Muhammad there.
There's a much longer version of that. I'm sure you could get. But that was admirably short.
I apologize, I missed part of the presentation, and someone may have addressed this, but I've been following the Colin Kaepernick and corporate America and it's not new of corporate America and advertising addressing kind of social justice issues, but I think that's such an intense focus and sort of laboratory at the moment for that particular issue. And as documentary filmmakers and with your expertise, do you find yourself being called by advertising agencies or corporate social responsibility departments, and how does that, what do you think about that? How do you interact with that? Is that good or bad? It's a generic question.
There's a lot of what's called branded content that's replacing advertising, where your storytelling is really speaking to the values of your brand. And it's very personal. Some documentary filmmakers, that's how they make their bread and butter, so that they can do the projects that they want to do. It's a way of financing a business. One of the biggest challenges in the documentary film world is that filmmakers don't get a lot of support from the private sector or the public sector. So you have to have 2 or 3 projects going at once in order to maintain any kind of overhead. So a lot of the branded content really helps maintain really good editors and staff, and so you don't have the inefficiencies. So I tend to be on the side of if a filmmaker engages with a brand and they come up with a storyline and they feel like their creative juices are being deployed and they feel good about the content they're creating, I think it's wonderful. And it's better, I'd rather watch a story than I'd rather be hit over the head with an advertisement. In fact, I turn off advertisements, or I switch channels, or I don't watch them, I skip them. So I think it's a new field, and it's not without complications, but it's emerged and it's here, is my take on it.
We have time for just one more question. Or do we have 2 people?
We have 2. We have Amir and Ron.
Okay, why don't we have 3? Okay, well, we're out of time. So let's hear 3 brief questions, and then we'll hear all the questions in a row, and then we'll try to answer them quickly.
So far, we've never followed that direction.
Exactly.
No. So
But
let's hear
exactly.
the 3 questions, and none of us will answer until all 3 of them are done. Just say.
Excellent
Mr. Quinn,
idea.
you discussed your heritage initially, and I know the spirituality of Hoop Dreams really, brought documentary to another level. Can you talk about how the making of that and how that might have increased your spirituality, where that's gone with your career, where it's driven your career since then?
Great, thank you.
So I'm asking whether you think that the commercial, we call it a commercial, that Nike just did with the football player whose name escapes me at the moment. But we know who he is. That strikes me as a mini documentary, or is that a commercial? And I guess that's my question.
Great, Ron?
I would just like to know, what are the stories that you would most like to see represented?
Great, thank you. Okay.
This poor gentleman, he's all over. There you go.
What about the effects of documentaries on the people being filmed? And I specifically want to ask about the person who introduced the film, but about the film of the pastor who was breaking down as he was telling us about that. And I presume that he could not have anticipated that would happen. Mm-hmm. And I was very glad to see it, but I wondered about my right to see it. And I wondered about the impact on him after the film was over. And I want to say something which I love this whole session, but I feel an intrusion in documentary filmmaking. And I've experienced that again and again over the past 2 days. I just want to get comments on it.
Okay, great. Thank you for those questions.
Quinn, why don't you tell us about your spiritual path?
Well,
you want to answer the Hoop Dreams question? Yeah.
Maybe I can tie 2 things together.
Great.
Because one of the things that we take that question very seriously. When I talk about documentary ethics, I say there is a contradiction. You as a storyteller have a responsibility to tell the truth, to get to the bottom of the story, to get to the most powerful way of telling it. But when you spend 4 or 5 years in people's lives, you have a responsibility to your subjects also. And those two things can often be in contradiction. So one of the things that we do is before we finish the film, when we can still make a change, we show it to our subjects and we say, look, you're going to get to see it. If there's something you can't live with, we will take it out. Now, I'm telling you up front, I'm going to argue with you. I'm going to tell you I have to see those tears, or I have to see you when you're really down, because then when you overcome those difficulties, that's the story arc, that's the payoff. It's not going to be, but at the end of the day, if we can't convince you, we'll take it out. We are still involved 25 some years, it's even more than 25 years now, with the Who Dreams families. I am often moved by people of faith and the power of what you experience when you experience them and the way it gives them strength in their lives. It has not changed my lack of faith. I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I'm just like, it's just not on my radar.
So, just in response to the Colin Kaepernick question, I start my religion film classes with a video that Mark Romanek did of Johnny Cash's version of Trent Reznor's Hurt. And it's great because, so it's raises all these questions of authorship and what are we doing here? So Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails sings this song about being a 30-year-old junkie. Cash sings it, changes one word about being like a 70-year-old ex-junkie. Mark Romanek makes this film that doesn't work out the way he wants to do it as a promotion for the Rick Rubin American Records. So the point of the exercise is to sell this record, but it's this amazing kind of thing. I mean, Nike's a business. Nike's business is making money. It's great that it's shown Colin some love, but at the end of the day, they're about the sort of commercial stuff. But can you get something, out of that? I remember when Vanilla Ice, to use a word that probably hasn't been uttered in these halls, did Ice Ice Baby and had a big hit. I can't remember you actually remember, Lorraine, who the interviewer was, who went to Chuck D and was hoping to get like the angry Negro response. So, what do you think? Chuck is one of the guys behind Public Enemy with Flavor Flav, about, this. And Chuck says, no, like, when you do your shows, you're selling cassettes out of the back of your truck. You're trying to sell as much as possible. So props to this guy for, selling this, that it's not about being a sellout, it's not doing this kind of thing. This guy's making money off this, great. This guy's making money off this. That's what we're all trying to do, in this business. So there's interesting kinds of lines, here in terms of that. And then that whole sense, and Gordon, you did it so well, that I was talking about this at lunch. My friend Gary Smith, phenomenal writer, who used to be a sports writer for Sports Illustrated and won half a dozen magazine writing awards, not just a dozen sports writing awards. But he's talked about when he does these stories of people, is he being a pornographer? Is he putting the people's pain up on view for people to, and he's talking about writing, not the visual part, which is a whole other thing. And he says, no, I mean, that's the difference, is there something meaningful, something learned, and obviously, getting the approval from people to say, okay, this is what we're going to show about you, is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a real gift of caretaking that the best documentary filmmakers exhibit in their relationships with the people who are in their films. As Gordon said, I mean, these are relationships that you build over time and that go on after the film is released. And I think it's truly that care and respect that goes into it, and there's generally a meeting of the minds, and that the subject or the person in the film does understand what's being put out there and agrees to it on some level because of the greater message or just the value in getting that story out.
Great. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so if we could thank our 4 panelists.